All right. Hello, everybody. Welcome to today's webinar and virtual roundtable, Breaking Funding Barriers for Black-led Organizations. My name is Amanda DeFonte. I'm our Senior Manager of Webinars and Events here at Bonterra, and I will be your facilitator today. I'm joining you live from Nashville, Tennessee. Normally, I'm in Washington, D.C., but I am here visiting my family. So super excited to be in a different location today. Feel free to write in the chat where you're coming from, your organization, foundation, corporation, wherever you might be joining from. We're super excited to see you all here today and love knowing who's joining. So feel free to put that in the chat, which will be open throughout the entirety of today's session. We're really looking forward to having this open conversation with you all. So throughout the session, please feel free to ask any questions within the Q&A section specifically, as well as use the chat to engage both with us and each other. We really want this to be interactive, and we want this conversation to be driven by you. And we will also be recording this session. So if you want to rewatch this or you need to leave early for some reason, we'll be emailing it out in the next couple of days. So super excited to have you all here. Thanks for joining us on this Tuesday. For those of you who are wondering who Bonterra is, we really love working with you all here today and lots of other organizations to serve the social responsibility sector and enable communities to do more good. We have brought together the innovative technology and unmatched experience of many organizations such as Cyber Grants, Every Action, Network for Good, Jumpstart, Social Solutions, WeSpire, and their respective entities with a purpose to power those who power social impact. Bonterra serves the people behind the scenes of social good, who we call the doers, by empowering them with best-in-class, purpose-built case management software, corporate social responsibility tools, nonprofit fundraising engagement technology, and much more. We service corporations, foundations, grant makers, nonprofit organizations, and public agencies. And if you want to learn a little bit more about any of our tools here or just some more about Bonterra, feel free to fill out the poll on the screen. I'll leave that up for a moment. We'd love to connect with you, learn a little bit more about the good that you're doing, and see if we can empower you to do any more. So I'll leave that up while I introduce our wonderful panel for today's roundtable. We are very fortunate to be joined by some amazing voices in the space. We'll have Kia Croom with us, who for over 2 decades has built a distinguished career in nonprofit fundraising and digital marketing. And after 22 years in the industry, Kia founded Kia Croom Fundraising Philanthropy, a comprehensive fundraising firm dedicated to working exclusively with organizations and institutions addressing structural inequities affecting Black and Brown communities. Kia also brings this work as a professional fundraising coach here at Bonterra and will be our moderator of today's conversation. So I'll turn it over to Kia in a bit, but we are also lucky to be enough to be joined by Marvin Pierre. Marvin currently serves as the co-founder and executive director of 8 Million Stories in Houston, Texas. Prior to taking on that role, Marvin was selected as a Bridge Fellow with the New Teacher Project, where he focused his fellowship on developing an alternative education program he called 8 Million Stories. That program became a reality, and he now aspires to append the school to prison pipeline by supporting previously incarcerated youth as they re-enter schools in Houston. Super lucky to have Marvin with us. We're also joined by Vanecia Kerr. Vanecia is responsible for developing, leading, and implementing the Mile High United Ways program strategy that advances the mission and creates sustainable community impact. That includes overseeing a portfolio of 7 programs serving 6,000 people and grants totaling over $3 million to their nonprofit community, while simultaneously engaging with community, government, and business leaders to ensure continuous evaluation, learning, and effectiveness. So another wealth of knowledge. here with us today. And last but certainly not least, we have Veronica Hemmingway. Veronica is the Southern Low Country Director for Grantmaking and Community Leadership at the Coastal Foundation of South Carolina, and I think maybe wins for longest job title and description. So commend you for saying that on a regular basis. She has more than 20 years experience in the nonprofit and philanthropic sector, working on both the fundraising side as well as the grant making and community leadership. She embraces people-centered and community-driven engagement and asset-based community development principles with an equity lens. So we're super lucky to have her with us here today as well. And I will now turn it over to Kia, who will be sort of facilitating and directing today's conversation to address some of our community agreements here.
Hi there. I'm so excited to be here with you all. I'm thrilled to see all of, I'm watching the chat and seeing folks chime in and pipe in from all over for this discussion. Thank you for being here. I want to briefly acknowledge community agreements. I'm not going to bore anybody by reading what's on the screen. I just simply want to acknowledge that we've got this illustrious, fabulous panel. We've got incredible lived experience that will be shared, discussed from Black philanthropy leaders, executives of our Black-led organization and Panelist, the co-founder and CEO of 8 Million Stories. Incredible lived experiences being shared here. And I think it's important to highlight that and honor the fact that we want to respect the lived experience held by the panelists and even individuals that may share feedback or pose questions in the chat. And lastly, I want to acknowledge that this isn't a spectator sport, good people. We welcome your questions. What I would simply ask of you, audience members, is that when you pose your questions, maybe hashtag ahead of them, maybe put in 3-4 hashtags so that we can distinguish questions from feedback in the chat. It makes it easier for me to see you and get to your questions. And without further ado, I'd like to jump into the discussion here. But first, let's indulge in a mission moment. Amanda, if you would cue that, just a moment of your time in the spirit of Sankofa, in celebration of Black History Month. When I speak about the spirit of Sankofa, Sankofa means that we must look back before we look forward. So I thought it was important to share this mission moment just to ground us as we proceed with the discussion.
George Floyd! What today? George Floyd! What today? George Floyd! Can't take no more! No peace! No justice! No peace! No KKK, no racist USA! No Trump! No KKK, no racist USA! No Trump!
The tragic murder of George Floyd at the hands of a Minneapolis police officer painfully underscored the fact that systemic racism is alive and present in our society. The global outrage around George Floyd's murder and the demands for racial justice that followed prompted the philanthropic sector to take action in the form of increased funding for Black-led organizations and even priorities around racial justice. However, as with many sectors, philanthropy too has its shadows, with Black-led organizations still facing significant disparities pertaining to their funding when compared to their white-led counterparts. I'd like to highlight a few data points that I think are particularly poignant in this space and time. According to Echoing Green and Bridgespan, Black-led nonprofits receive 24% less revenue than white-led organizations. And there's receipts. The unrestricted assets, which we know is a critical form of stability for organizations, are less than 76% for Black-led organizations. And as I noted a moment ago, following George Floyd's murder, we saw a surge in commitments for Black-led organizations, with some $340 billion being committed alone from corporate philanthropies. That's according to the McKinsey Institute for Black Economic Mobility. Similarly, we saw foundations, private and otherwise, come to the table with significant resources for Black-led organizations. Yet, in subsequent years, the past 2 years, I would share to be exact, we've seen some disheartening retrenchment, leading many of us to believe the surge in giving to Black-led organizations was somewhat of a momentary trend, akin to crisis giving. And this ebb and flow of support for Black-led organizations who have historically had to do more with less, I would argue, are more vulnerable now than before. Before we delve deeper into this topic, I thought it was important to share that mission moment, center us, and I'd like for you to remember as audience members, or go back to where you were in the midst of the racial reckoning, and what you were seeing, what you were hearing, right, in this space and time. And I'd like for you to think about the events as of late, some of which were relatively recent, right? The retrenchment of affirmative action, right? The SCOTUS decision, and just the landscape that is the landscape that we're all seeing and the developments play out and how they impact the work that we're doing in this space as we move forward. And without further ado, I'd like to jump into the discussion. We've got our first question, which I'd like to pose to my esteemed panel. What are some of the unique challenges faced by Black-led organizations? What are you hearing? What are you observing or even experiencing firsthand? I'd like to start with Veronica. I'd love to hear from you. What are you seeing, observing as a Black philanthropy leader in this space?
Thank you, Kia, for that question. I think as I was listening to you, the first thing that came to mind was, a number of the Black-led organizations that I talk with frequently, that the retrenchment that you're talking of was not unexpected. And I think that is what kind of resonates with me the most. Some of them have been, running their nonprofits for some time, but some of them were just elders, right? And they were like, we've seen this cycle before in different ways. So whenever I'm asked this question, I go, well, if you talk to a lot of people, no one is surprised. Disappointed perhaps, but not exactly surprised at the retrenchment in the giving. But one of the other things that I hear, and probably more often than not is just that there is a disconnect between Black-led, Black-serving organizations and foundations because there's no trust. They don't know us and we don't know them. And oftentimes, it's that building of the relationship and building of the trust that is key. And oftentimes in philanthropy, we like immediate results, right? You'll hear people say, oh, we didn't get an impact, if you will, in a certain amount of time, then it's like, it's not working. But I often will offer the suggestion that any relationship that you have in your life that is good and healthy takes time. And so oftentimes they're just not feeling the commitment from philanthropy.
Uh-oh, Veronica, it looks like you're freezing. It looks like you froze. Veronica, panelist, someone responded. Oh, you're back. I apologize. We didn't get the last part of what you said. You froze a little, but you were saying a healthy relationship, any sort of relationship that's healthy takes time. Absolutely.
Right. And just wanting to see philanthropy kind of show up on a consistent basis and recognize that there still has to be some level of trust and understanding. And one thing I will raise before I, let others comment is that as a Black person in philanthropy, what I hear from Black-led organizations is they'll come and say, well, I feel comfortable asking you because you're another Black person to demystify this world and this process for me. And I think that's something that doesn't get talked about a lot, but is really key, the understanding of the jargon. How does this work? It kind of boils down to, if you're serious about engaging me and supporting me, are you equally as committed to meeting me where I am without judgment? And I think that's really important.
Trust, absolutely. Very important, right? When we talk about philanthropy, there's a lot of conversations about trust-based philanthropy, and I want to dig a little bit deeper there, and we'll talk, and we'll see you nod, and we'll get to it. But first, I'd like to hear from Marvin. Marvin is doing remarkable work. You're on the ground, you're working with young people in your community in Houston. What are you experiencing, seeing, observing as a Black leader running a nonprofit in this space, a Black-led organization leader?
Yeah, great question. Pleasure first to be on the panel with you all. I definitely think, in response to what already has been said, definitely not surprised by the shifts. We just know the nature of philanthropy is very cyclical. But for me, what I am seeing right now, especially with Black-led organization, is the inability to rebound from this injection of funds that came as a result of the George Floyd situation, right? And so a lot of organizations, small, large, got an influx of cash. Most of the ones that were not really built out when it comes to infrastructure didn't really know how to really use those funds in a way to create more sustainability and also further develop those additional relationships with philanthropy. And so what we see right now is like founders and leaders are now trying to figure out what's next, right? How do I keep my work moving now that what I thought was going to be a continuum of support is no longer the case? So how do I now pivot? And we find a lot of our leaders are really stuck. And that's one of the things I constantly talk about, right? It's, at some point we have to look at how do we, make the ask of philanthropy to develop our leaders, right? To be able to produce the impact reports and all of the things that go into, creating more funding sustainability. And a lot of our leaders, they're, it's the luck of the draw, right? Because I even think about my personal experience starting my organization, $80,000 in a hole. I never raised money, right? And so there's so much anxiety for us as Black leaders that go into asking people for money. It's a very hard thing for us to do. A lot of cultural connections to it. And a lot of folks have not been able to overcome that challenge. And because of that, their organizations have not flourished in the way that they have the potential to be, right? We have a lot of leaders across the country doing great work, but fundraising is continuing to be a challenge for them, right? And it's all about who you have access to, how are you managing those relationships and developing them and sustaining them, right? And I really think when we look at philanthropy, all of it is rooted in relationships. And if you're not really someone that is, big on doing that, you kind of fall out of place in terms of like being able to access the resources and the funding that you need to continue to drive your organization. So to answer your question, I just feel like people are in this place where they're really trying to, figure out how do they make the pivot to continue to build on that short level of momentum that they had as a result of the George Floyd movement.
No, I thank you for that. And I want to just double down on something that you mentioned. You said a couple of things that I want to unpack, and then we'll hear from Vanecia. I want folks to really see where we're coming from, where you're coming from as a Black leader in this space, running an organization, responding to a critical need in your community, right? Of serving young people and preparing them for promising futures, right? Black-led organizations receive this huge cash infusion over the last couple of years, right? Some organizations saw more funding in the last couple of years than they've seen in their entire existence, right? Resources came from organizations that companies, philanthropies that they might not have ever even heard of before, right? And necessarily had a relationship with, right? And they received this cash infusion as though this one-time cash infusion, in a lot of cases, there's a lot of one-time funding on the table, right? As though racial injustice, racial inequities just go away, right? So these temporary commitments, these organizations receive these infusions in cash in a space and time. I personally know organizational leaders who use funds to scale their programs. Perhaps they hadn't had the resources in prior years to do that. They fed more kids in after-school programs, right? And last year, but now in 2023, those dollars are no longer on the table, which makes it hard for them to respond to the needs of their constituents. And I want to be honest, it's counterintuitive. So I appreciate you. It's counterintuitive, and it's to some degree, I would say, sabotaging to the efforts of these organizations that are doing this work. So I thank you for being so candid and sharing your lived experience, right? Of what it's like to be a recipient of dollars to advance and drive and move your programs and impact, and then suddenly have that same funding, right, pulled back, and you're essentially back at square one, right? Vanecia, I'd love to hear from you. What are you seeing? What are you observing, hearing as a Black leader in this space with a portfolio of donors?
Yeah, thank you so much, Kia, and thank you for having me here today. One of the things that I would say is likely to echo what has already been said in terms of funding. I think when you shared the information about the surge in giving that has happened over the last couple of years, it is definitely true. We are seeing it all over the country. We're seeing it definitely here in Denver, Colorado. But what I can say is that over the last year, that has decreased. That surge that happened at the height of the pandemic, that was also driven by what you so aptly described related to the murder of George Floyd. And what has happened since then is lots of influx of dollars that have come in. And then there has been somewhat of a cliff where those dollars came in and then they just stopped. And that is something that is particularly challenging for the nonprofit community. Of course, I work at United Way, which is a large nonprofit, and here in Denver, it's Mile High United Way. And we're also seeing a reduction in dollars that are coming in more recently. But what we know is that when we see dollars decreasing at large organizations like Mile High United Way, what you see in the Black community is even more drastic than that. There's lots of language around, like when you see a recession, in the broader community, you see a depression in the Black community. And it's a similar type of analogy here with philanthropy in the Black community, because what's happening is the funding has been decreased significantly in the Black community. And the other piece that I would mention is, like, how do you get back to addressing that challenge of the reduction in dollars that are coming in to support those programs? Is through the network and increasing access to key influencers, like what Marvin was describing. And that is not always easy and available in terms of access for people in the Black community that are trying to lead these organizations. The other thing that I'll mention, and then I'll stop, because this is a topic obviously that is very important to all of us, is that we know that access is extremely important, but we have seen it across many different industries where some people are given an opportunity because they know someone else. And that's not always true in the Black community. So the access to the people who have the dollars is not always there. And so that creates the challenge of, how do I go about getting the funding, which generally has nothing to do with whether or not the organization is performing, whether or not those outcomes are there. They are usually there, but they just don't have the access to the people who have the dollars to help support their programs.
Yeah, so what I'm hearing you talk about, Vanecia, is human capital, or rather social capital, right? So let's, before we move on to our next question, I want to double down on this. This is very, very important. When you talk about someone that looks like myself, Marvin, Vanecia, Veronica, right? Black folk, let's just call it what it is, right? I don't know very many Black leaders in this space that, were born with a silver spoon in their mouth, right? A lot of the folks that I know, and I don't claim to know everybody, but a lot of the folks that I know, and research from organizations like the Building Movement Project shows that Black people and people of color have incredible intrinsic experience when they come to work in nonprofit space, right? Their lived experience with poverty, with systems of inequity, systems of oppression, right? Take me, for instance, I grew up in the height of the crack epidemic in East Oakland during the war on drugs, in extreme generational poverty. As such, I didn't have parents that had connections to Jack and Jill that were in Divine Nine organizations. I wasn't a trust fund baby. I'm shut out of high net worth groups of individuals, right? That's not a resource that was just readily available to me. So what I'm hearing you say, Vanecia, is, more than just the money, but yes, the money is necessary. Just as important is that advocacy and that networking and increased access to those high networks for Black leaders, people of color leaders, however you slice it, that don't ordinarily have access to those networks. It's that advocacy, that sponsorship, that visibility that moves gears in addition to those funding resources. And unfortunately, not so much of that is happening for Black-led organizations, and it's essential to their success, is what I'm hearing you say. Yay or nay, is that where, am I getting at what you're saying, just to amplify, because this is important stuff.
Yes, Kia, I think like what you're saying and you're amplifying is correct, because funding is one piece of it, and then access to it is extremely important. You know, as someone who I spent a little over 10 years on the fundraising side before I moved into my current role that I'm in today. So I have a little bit of experience in what it takes to raise funds for a nonprofit organization. And I had to learn pretty quick that it was important to expand my network and to build this pipeline that would include key influencers that were important to help drive the funding that was necessary to support the mission for the nonprofit organizations that I was working with. And, you know, saying that you want the funding and the grant pieces, of course, you can write a great grant, but you also need to be out there networking and trying to meet some of these people, to your point, who can write the checks and help support the organizations. And that's not always easy to do. And it requires a lot of work, and likely also some specific training around that, on how to get access to the people who actually have the dollars to support the work that you're doing.
Thank you for that. I want to move on to our next question. I see a couple of great questions and feedback in the chat. Someone said that they were disappointed yet not surprised by the funding retrenchments and and let's be clear, folks, we're not just talking about a retrenchment in funding. We're talking about a retrenchment in priorities. There are a number of philanthropies that I've personally come across that had a priority for racial equity and dollars behind it that are no longer doing that just a year, 2 years later. So it's a retrenchment in priorities as well. I'm seeing folks that I know, shout out to Brandy and the Hype Freedom Schools. I see you all. Someone says, in your opinion, what can nonprofit serving organizations like Candid do to support BIPOC-led and serving nonprofits? Stephen, hold that thought. We're going to hopefully respond to your question with our next question, which I'd like to pose to the panel. And that is, given the current backdrop, what is your agency doing to support Black-led organizations in this space and time? I'd like to hear specifically from Vanecia and Veronica. Why don't we start with Veronica?
Okay, thank you.
Yes.
Just to kind of give a little backdrop to my answer. So here at my foundation, we started this process, you know, with an equity lens, probably back in 2017, looking at our grant making programs to see then how much we're going to not just Black-led organizations, but just smaller organizations, which there's often the overlap there. And no surprise, it shows that Black-led organizations and smaller organizations weren't getting access, weren't getting funded at the same level as others. So what we started out doing was like, how do we get at this? So, you know, it's evolved over time, doing some equity lens, applying an equity lens to our competitive grant making programs, but it also has evolved to the point where we now have a focus on Black-led, Black serving organizations, really trying to target them so that we can get a match based on the populations that we serve, like different counties. Like if the population of Black people is whatever percentage, we're trying to aim for that to be the level of funding that goes to Black-led, Black serving organizations as a start. That's where we're starting. And again, you know, doing that work goes back to what I said earlier. We're starting to build the relationships and the trust, right? And looking at our data, looking at who's applying from those underrepresented organizations. But not only that, we're also looking at the capacity side of it, because to Marvin's point, it's not enough just to give somebody, you know, this money. Look, what are the strategies? Where to support? Where are you building the capacity? Are you supplying them with those needs? But yeah, we're just really starting to roll out our Black-led, Black serving work. We took our time with it because we wanted it to be done with as much efficacy as we could do, but not wanting to drag our feet, because we often know in philanthropy, sometimes we like to meet and talk. By the time we finish meeting and talking, the need is 10 times worse or whatever. So we have been very intentional about that. But we are starting again, as I said, based on the percentage population, based on the last census, which, you know, I'm not sure how confident we all are in the numbers that we all saw in the last census too. So, but that is kind of where we're starting with our organization, and it's the relationships. It's finding people who applied before and didn't apply again. Why didn't you? What was your experience like? Tell us frankly, so that we can address those and make those changes. So we're doing the listening and the learning along the way, because we don't want to do what we want to do. We want to do what needs to be done. And we have an open feedback loop in that process. And we've heard some hard things, but that's okay. We are fine. And we are making those adjustments as we go forward in more than just the funding. We are looking at capacity building and incorporating the other principles of capital, the social, the moral, the intellectual, the relational. We employ all of those in how we do this work, and not just dollars and not just capacity, but how else can we show up for you in the ways that we know get you access to the funding and the support that you need.
No, this is wonderful. And I'm encouraged, Veronica, to hear that your organization did some of that work prior in, really deploying or building consensus around the need to better resource Black-led organizations in your community. I love the fact that you took it to the streets and talked to Black leaders and heard from Black leaders, as opposed to what some philanthropic entities are guilty of, which is assuming that they know or that they know better because they're in a position of power and have resource. I'm encouraged by the fact that you took it and got that feedback. And I'm encouraged by the intentionality that your organization or your leadership is taking to make sure that these efforts are sustainable, impactful, and iterative, because I think that that's part of what has to be owned, is that this is iterative. It's gonna continue to change and evolve over time. And I love that you're being so candid about those hard truths, right? I appreciate that. I'd love to hear from you, Vanecia. What is the United Way in your leadership, your team, doing to support these organizations in light of what we're seeing play out these days?
Yes, thank you for the question. And what I'll start by saying is that it's not new for our organization to have a commitment to diversity, equity, and inclusion. I mean, it has been, embedded as part of our organization for many years. I think what we are seeing as, in more recent years is that we are taking it to the next level. And what I mean by that is that we are embedding diversity, equity, and inclusion throughout our organization through a number of different facets, which also include 9 DEI strategies that we have that were developed by our staff. And through that, we are also working towards how do you actually take those strategies and embed those in the work that we do each and every day with the communities that we serve. So I wanted to lay that as a foundation to answering the question, because it will then also help you understand that 2 things that I want to highlight today in relation to this particular question is our partnership with Bonterra and how we have worked with them to support organizations that are minority-led and specifically Black-led organizations through our social justice fund that was developed after the murder of George Floyd. And we wanted to do something that was very specific and very intentional to help support the Black community. And so the Social Justice Fund was developed around that time. And then the partnership with Bonterra really allowed us to utilize the program called Jumpstart to help provide one-on-one coaching as well as a tool around fundraising to support those organizations, which, as Veronica mentioned, are smaller organizations, have a tendency to be minority-led. And the data was actually showing us that they were raising significantly less dollars each year than other organizations in our community. So it was an opportunity for us to double down and figure out how do we actually support them in a different kind of way by providing the tools and resources that are needed in order for them to be successful. So that was another way that we actually worked with Bonterra related to that. The other thing that I want to mention is our new grant process. We actually revamped our grant process over the last year. And what I mean by that is that we traditionally had a grant process where individuals were applying or organizations were applying to grants. And there's a tendency that when you have community reviewers, those individuals are looking at the grant itself. They're looking at the, how the grant was written. So unfortunately, if you're able to write a really great grant, then you may be able to get, additional funding, right? Or if you were able to hire a grant writer, then you may be been able to put yourself in a different position to obtain a grant. Now, what we know is that our minority-led organizations are not always in a place where they can hire a grant writer to make sure that their grant has all the I's dotted and the T's crossed.
Amen.
So what we decided to do was to shift our process completely. We turned it up on, turned it on its head, so to speak. And we actually decided to have conversations with each applicant rather than requiring them to write pages and pages of documents, so that we can get to exactly what they're doing and exactly what their outcomes are. The feedback that we received from nonprofit organizations was fantastic. And we are also now moving in this direction where not only are we looking at the grant writing process being different, but also the reporting process where we can have a conversation with them and they can tell us exactly what they're doing instead of requiring that this grant writing is so perfect that it skews what the work is that they're actually doing. We want to focus on the work and what the outcomes are for the community and be able to fund that.
No, this is wonderful. This is really, really great feedback, great tactics you're sharing. I hope that the audience members, those particularly in the philanthropic space, are taking note. What I'm hearing you say is you've overhauled some approaches. You have streamlined reporting processes as part of trust-based philanthropy. And if you're not familiar with trust-based philanthropy and you're on the line, I encourage you to do a little research. Wow, before we get out of here, I'll see if I can find a link, or if anybody, one of you on the panel has a link that we could share with audience members about trust-based philanthropy. Those that aren't familiar, that would be great to share if I could count on one of you to do that, because I want to get to a couple of questions here. Somebody beat me to it. Thank you, Selena. Selena Lee, you saved the day. I appreciate it. Check out Selena Lee's link on trust-based philanthropy. That's a tenet, and it is streamlining the reporting burden, the application requirements, so that we can really get to the nut of the meat of the work, right, that organizations are on the ground doing, as opposed to being burdensome in the grant making process, right? Couple of great questions have come to the forefront, and before we leave this area, I have one question for you, Marvin, but please indulge me as I lift up a couple of questions. It looks like folks are curious about the best ways to afford Black leaders with access. to, those networks we talked about, those high net worth individuals. It could be as simple as hosting convenings. If you're a philanthropy and you've got other philanthropic groups, organizations, corporate foundations in your network, ways that you can amplify the work of your Black-led organizations in your portfolio is hosting convenings, having conversations with folks about some of the remarkable work that your Black-led organizations that you're funding are doing, profiling them in your newsletters, more story resource. Those are a couple of things that come to mind for me. I see a question, Marvin, that I'd like to direct to you. It comes from, goodness gracious, I'm scrolling, comes from Brandy Brown in Houston, your hometown. She's wanting to know, Marvin, what are you doing when you think about breaking funding barriers? What does relationship building look like for you?
I mean, I think first, I know Brandy very well, and she is definitely in an organization to check out. She's doing some great work in Houston with High Freedom School, and is actually leading the coalition building of giving Black leaders access to each other and sharing the network. So she is definitely someone I would encourage everyone on this call to reach out to. But for me, I think in terms of, how we're trying to manage those relationships is really understanding the journey, right? And so it's like, Veronica said earlier, right? Relationships, good ones, take time to develop, right? And so sometimes we make the unfortunate mistake of thinking that one meeting with a funder is enough to solidify a financial investment. And that's not necessarily the case, unless they are reaching out to you and asking you to apply for funding. It's a different case. But if you are sourcing out those funders and you're looking to have them look closer at the work that you're doing and ultimately support it, that is something that you have to manage over time, right? When I thought about my journey of starting 8 Million Stories, in my first year, my expectation was not that they were going to give me significant funds, right? I was getting anywhere from $2,500, $5,000. I had one foundation, an amazing sister that led a great organization, Kelly King Jackson with the Simmons Foundation at the time. She took a big investment in me, right? And I was just kind of putting out the whole concept, didn't have no impact, but she invested a good amount of money in me. But that was the only one. Right. Every other investor or funder that I reached out to, it was just kind of sprinkles of cash, right? Nothing that you could really mobilize and move an organization. But I understood the journey and the relationship that I was engaging in with philanthropy, that this was going to be something I would have to develop and grow over time, because it goes back to that one word we talked about throughout this entire time today, trust, right? And so for us, unfortunately, as Black-led leaders, there is an issue with trust in the space of philanthropy. And I knew going into those conversations that the only way to break that barrier and that engage in having them trust me more is to show impact, right? And to show that with the $5,000 or $10,000 that you gave me, here's what I did. And having the transparent conversations about our successes and also our shortcomings, right? That's what funders often don't hear, right? They don't hear where you're not moving the needle, where you're struggling. They want to hear that too, because what it tells you is that I'm transparent. So when something's not going well, I'm gonna always keep it 100 with you, right? I'm always gonna tell you what I'm doing, what I'm struggling, and being very honest with my goals. I'm not gonna tell you I'm gonna serve 1,000 kids in my first year. I was serving the most marginalized kids in Houston. So I knew that work is really hard to move, especially in my first year. So I really set realistic goals. And I really wanted people to know that you can invest in me. And so those relationships wasn't really about the impact that 8 Million Stories was making in its first year. A funder is investing in you. So in that conversation, I have to walk away believing that you are worth the $50,000, the $100,000, that if I give Marvin $100,000, he is going to do something remarkable with it, or he's just going to manage it the right way. Right? Not blow it on things that do not move the needle, do not advance the mission. And if you can show people that, whether it's in a year or 2 years, the increase of that funding and that ask is there, right? And that's what we've been able to do over the last 6 years to keep us in business, essentially.
No, I'm very proud of the work that you're doing with 8 Million Stories. It's quite remarkable. And you raised a very important point, something that I commend, which is transparency. I've been working in this space for 23 years. Where I'm challenged, where I'm struggling, I communicate that as a Black leader, executive in the space. I communicate with that and have frank and honest conversations, right, with philanthropy about the situations that we're finding ourselves in. I want to go to the last question, but before I do that, someone raised a question, and I think it's a loss on me to not have defined this up front. Someone has asked, how do we define Black-led organizations? What I can share with you is that Black-led organizations are defined as those where the leadership is predominantly Black, where more than 51% in most cases of the leadership is Black and or brown people, Black people, and as you know, we're having a conversation about Black-led organizations, 51% or more. I want to quickly get to the last question here, and I'm going to ask that our panelists be as succinct as possible in their responses in the interest of time. What's it going to take for philanthropy to level the playing field for Black-led organizations in as impactful and sustainable way, as succinctly as you can? I want to pivot to Vanecia.
Thank you so much, Kia. I'll try to be as succinct as possible as we talk about what it takes to actually level the playing field here. What I will say is, something that I mentioned earlier is access is definitely one step that needs to happen, and access can look a lot of different ways, from introductions to people who are in the place, again, like to write those checks. And that can be actually really powerful for the organizations. I had the pleasure of creating an introduction for a smaller nonprofit organization to a very big funder here in the area. And just through that organization, or introduction, I should say, they were able to get $25,000 because that particular funder just didn't know that this organization existed, and it is a Black-led organization. So I think those of us who are in the place of knowing people and able to create those introductions, then we should. I think we have a responsibility to open those doors for others so that they can walk through those doors and actually have that access. Because again, I think a lot of organizations already have great outcomes, but there may be a situation where the funders just don't know who they are. So how do you open those doors to create that access? And then the other thing that I would say is, once you have that access, then I think it's about the relationships and continuing to build those. I think Marvin talked about that as well. It's one thing to create an introduction. It's another thing to create an ongoing relationship with someone who's in a position to help support your organization. So I'll just leave it there. Thank you.
No, thank you for that. Veronica, what are your thoughts?
Okay, and I don't know if I've ever heard of a short benediction, but okay, Kia. We'll give it a shot. Right. No, I would echo what Vanecia said about the access and the capacity, just kind of bringing people. It's kind of that notion of I come as one, but I stand as 10,000. Like when you bring them into the spaces that you're in and you share their work. I think for me, because I work in rural communities in the South, and so for me, it's the capacity building, and not just traditional capacity building, right? It is about meeting people where they are. When they tell you because to Marvin's point, if I give you a lot of money, but then 2 years later come back and say, well, you didn't manage it. Well, where was I going to get this capacity knowledge? Like that's not okay. So the capacity building that we do is that when they tell me this is what I need on this topic, I deliver it, period. I'm not concerned that everyone, if you're starting at 1, my concern is not that you end up as a 10 in capacity. Where did you move along the continuum? Do you have the knowledge to now build into the way your organization runs forevermore? You have the knowledge and the tools. Did you move along this continuum towards whatever that goal is for you? So it's the knowledge, the demystification. That is the part of the capacity building that I'm talking about, and delivering it in a way that is respectful. I'm gonna say that again, respectful.
Hello.
To the people that are asking you. That is a real thing for me, and I take that very seriously. It has to be done that way. And I gotta circle back. It's the relationships. They have to trust us. They have to trust us. We have to show up consistently and do what we say we're going to do. And that will go a long way.
Thank you for that, Veronica. Marvin, final thoughts before we prepare to close.
I think it centers a lot of what has already been said, but also transparency. I really hope the philanthropic space is more transparent with our organizations, right? Tell them what they're not doing well, right? That's the way you're going to help them get better so that they can build sustainability. They can get those fundings instead of just kind of say, oh, thank you for submitting. And then you don't fund them, but you don't give them the reasons why they didn't really do it. And don't give them something that's PC, right? If you're really about, being transparent and creating more equitable access for Black-led organizations, tell them like, hey, your presentation was not strong. You didn't show up. And on the flip side, for us, we got to know what's at stake too. When we do have those moments, this is it, right? You got to show up in your best self and put your best foot forward. And if you're not doing that, we can't expect them to invest in us, right? Again, it goes back, I'm investing in the leader. So if the leader is not showing up in the best way possible, there is no way someone's giving you $50,000, $100,000 and think that you're going to do something transformational with it. How we present ourselves is everything, right? And we have to get to understanding that our organizations have to run like a business. Nonprofit, yes, we have the hard work. We want to do good, but we are a business and we have to run and conduct ourselves as such.
No, thank you for that. And I think you've said so much. I just thank each of you for your wisdom, your nuggets. Before I popcorn back over to Amanda to take us on home, I just want to say that my heart is full. I feel as though I've gotten somewhat of a needed catharsis because this work is heavy, it's arduous, it's heart-wrenching, and talking with you all on the line here, hearing from the audience, my heart is full and encouraged. Despite having seen some pretty discouraging things over the last few weeks, I just want to thank Bonterra for giving us a platform to have this conversation. I'm not a fan of courageous conversations. I want to normalize this conversation. It should not be a courageous conversation when we talk about resourcing Black-led organizations for the long haul. Let's continue to amplify these kinds of conversations and transform them into tangible, durable change within our spheres of influence, as this journey will be ongoing. And I just want to share that I'm committed, as is Bonterra, to working with anyone who wants to ensure that equity for Black-led organizations is prioritized and realized. And with that, I want to pivot back to Amanda and just say thank you to everybody for your time today.
Yes, thank you so much, Kia, Marvin, Vanecia. Veronica had a tight turnaround, so I think she had to jump, but appreciate her being here. And if anyone is interested in learning a little bit more about doing some of that work that everyone was talking about here alongside Bonterra, I'm just going to leave that quick poll up one last time. If you want to learn about how you can leverage some of our tools, some of these wonderful coaches who we have on board, I'll leave that there. But I really wanted to extend my huge gratitude to our panel here. I mean, these conversations, to your point, Kia, are not encouraging always, are not uplifting, and can be difficult, right? And to share your personal stories, experiences, reflect, and also look to the future while looking backwards at the same time is really important, and not always an easy thing to do. So thank you so much to all of you for being here. Thank you for the work that you're doing on the ground with your communities, and now with each other on this panel. And if we weren't able to get to your questions, so sorry. There were so many good ones that came in, and this was such a great conversation. I'm already smelling a part 2, maybe. I'll leave that here for this group, because really, wow, and thank you. I can't say enough kind words. And Kia, thanks for guiding us through this conversation as well. Your leadership here today was very much appreciated. So I hope everyone has a great rest of your week and day and end of summer here as we close out. Thank you so much, everybody. I hope you have a wonderful day.
Thank you.
Take care, folks.